Welcome to Sleep Stories, the place where wandering hearts find a soft landing. Tonight, let your breath slow, let your shoulders loosen, and allow the quiet magic of our world to settle gently around you. Here, we weave tales not just of spells and enchanted halls, but of courage, kindness, and the small triumphs that shape who we become. Every story is crafted to guide you into calmness, to wrap your mind in warmth, and to remind you that even in the busiest world, there is still room for wonder. So as you settle into your pillow, listen closely, beyond the candlelit corridors of Hogwarts, past portraits whispering forgotten secrets, and under the glow of floating lanterns, a new story begins. It is a tale of three souls, Draco, Alistair, and young Alfie, each walking their own path of discovery. It is a story about fear, hope, second chances, and the kind of bravery that doesn't always come from magic. If you're ready, take a deep breath, let the world quiet itself, and step with me into tonight's tale. Because here at Sleep Stories, every night is a journey, and every journey begins with a single moment of stillness.
The tale opens the way as soft winter evening settles over a quiet village, slowly, gently, with a warmth that seeps into the bones before the listener even notices it happening. The narrator speaks not from a grand stage, but from the comforting nearness of an armchair beside a low-burning fire, addressing the audience as though they were curled beneath a blanket, shoes kicked off, day tucked quietly behind them. It is an invitation, tender and unhurried. Come closer, rest a moment. Let the world soften around you. From the very first lines, the narrative wraps itself in the signature Sleep Stories cadence sentences that drift like mist across a moonlit pond. Words chosen not to excite, but to soothe. There is nostalgia woven into every syllable. The sweet ache of remembering childhood Septembers when the world felt full of secret doors and invisible possibilities. The narrator gently teases that universal longing, the shy, stubborn part of us that once glanced toward the mailbox, hoping for a parchment envelope sealed in red wax. It is a wistful longing, but not a painful one. The tone is playful, almost conspiratorial, as if the narrator is smiling into the storybook while turning the page. Rather than promising grand quests or thundering duels, the introduction lights a smaller, softer kind of magic, the magic of belonging, rediscovering, wandering familiar halls with new eyes. This is a story not of world-saving heroes, but of quiet moments. Lanterns glowing in drafty corridors, cocoa steaming in cold hands, students whispering beneath floating candles. The pacing is intentionally cinematic. Long shots of autumn leaves tumbling across the castle grounds. Slow pans through stone corridors alive with memory. Close-ups on gentle smiles and flickering hearths. Every detail invites the reader to breathe a little deeper. The narrator positions the story not as something told to the listener, but something shared with them. A communal experience, a gentle escape, a small window into a world both extraordinary and strangely familiar. This meta-narrative touch creates intimacy, reminding the reader that they, too, are part of the tradition of stories retold at night, the quiet ritual of being guided into dreams by a patient voice and a comforting world. And beneath the warmth, a subtle promise glows, that magic is not confined to wands or incantations. It lives in memories, in friendships, in the faint shimmer of wonder we allow ourselves to feel even as adults. The introduction becomes a threshold, a softly glowing doorway into a tale meant not to thrill the heart, but to steady it. A place where the pace of life slows, where the old world of Hogwarts unfurls again in gentle hues, and where the reader is welcomed not as an observer, but as a dreamer returning home. And so, with the storybook now open and its first warm glow spilling softly across the listener's imagination, the narrator turns the page and the gentle light falls unexpectedly upon a familiar figure. Not a bright-eyed child beginning their magical journey, but a man who once walked these halls with far too much pride and now returns with far too little certainty. That man, of course, is Draco Malfoy, His appearance here feels almost like fate having a small laugh to itself, for nothing introduces the theme of rediscovery more poignantly than someone who never wished to rediscover anything at all. Post-war Draco is not the sneering boy readers remember. Time has softened his edges in some places and sharpened them in others. There is humor in his bitterness, vulnerability in his sarcasm, and a surprising gentleness hidden beneath the familiar Malfoy frost. When asked quite innocently what his most agonizing Hogwarts memory was, listeners might expect grim recollections of battles, curses, and haunting regrets. But Draco, with impeccable dryness, declares that nothing compares to the agony of attempting to teach first years who cannot cast even the faintest hint of a shield charm. This blend of humor and honesty sets the emotional tone of his arc. A man wearing sarcasm like armor, unaware that the cracks already show. His first classroom scene makes this painfully and comically clear. Determined to project the authority of his former professors, Draco channels Snape's icy disdain and McGonagall's razor-sharp precision. The result is an uneven hybrid at best. Students blink at him as though they've been given a riddle with no answer key. Draco glares back, wondering how the universe has engineered such a personal punishment. Yet in this awkwardness lies the early seed of transformation. The way students react to him, half in awe, half in terror, and wholly confused, mirrors the conflicted way Draco now views himself. Someone caught between who he was and who he must learn to become. The story then softens into a flashback, drifting like flue smoke into the quiet of Draco's office at Gringotts. Papers stack in weary piles. A quill leaks onto his sleeve. His patience, already fragile, snaps entirely when Minerva McGonagall's head appears in the fireplace with an expression that brooks no refusal. Her insistence that Draco take the newly vacant Defense Against the Dark Arts position is delivered with the same voice she once used to escort misbehaving students by the ear. Draco argues, deflects, complains, yet beneath the banter sits something deeper. The fear of returning to the one place where every stone remembers who he used to be. In the end, he accepts, not out of noble purpose, but because McGonagall refuses to remove her head from his fireplace until he does. His reluctant agreement becomes the hinge on which his story turns a man who believes Hogwarts has no place for him stepping, however grudgingly, back into its waiting halls. And with that, the gentle magic of sleep stories carries the listener onward, guiding them beside Draco as he begins the uncomfortable, humorous, and quietly healing journey of returning home. And so, with Draco's reluctant agreement still echoing like a resigned sigh in the flue ash of his office, the story drifts forward softly, steadily into the moment he steps once more beneath the ancient arches of Hogwarts. The transition feels almost dreamlike. One heartbeat he is in Gringotts, irritable and exhausted, and in the next, he is standing inside the castle he once knew intimately and now barely recognizes through the haze of years and regret. Hogwarts greets him with the same visual splendor it always possessed, floating candles flickering above the Great Hall, enchanted ceilings shifting with the weather, students chattering excitedly as the new term unfolds. But for Draco, the familiar beauty feels strangely distant, as though he is looking at a painting of his childhood rather than walking into it. The nostalgia is not warm. It presses against him with the weight of ghosted memories and unasked questions. He carries himself with cool composure, but the castle seems to watch him, whisper about him, remember him. The sorting feast becomes the crucible of this uncomfortable homecoming. Draco sits at the staff table, a place he once stared at with adolescent trepidation, and now he sits among the very people who once gave him detentions, warnings, and carefully measured disappointment. Across the hall, students sneak glances at him, their whispers darting like mischievous sprites. Some eyes widen with recognition from history books, others narrow with inherited judgment. Draco pretends not to notice, adjusting his goblet, straightening his cuffs, performing minor rituals of avoidance that betray how tightly strung he is. His responses to social overtures only deepen the awkwardness. When a charms professor beside him attempts friendly conversation, Draco answers with Snape-like brevity, sharp, clipped, unintentionally unfriendly. He regrets it immediately, but lacks the courage to soften his tone. His new office doesn't help. Its bare shelves and cold stone walls reflect his own emotional emptiness. He arranges his parchment meticulously, not because he cares, but because order feels safer than vulnerability. Yet the castle, stubbornly alive as always, refuses to let him remain closed off. McGonagall visits him one evening. Her knock, gentle but firm. She does not offer pity, something Draco could not bear, but quiet reassurance. She acknowledges his past without flinching and affirms her belief in his capacity to grow. Her words settle over him like a warm cloak he does not know how to wear. Draco deflects with sarcasm, of course, but the softened tension in his shoulders betrays the comfort he takes from her presence. And it is in that small, fragile exchange that the seed of healing is planted. The castle may remember the boy he was, but it has also made room for the man he is trying awkwardly, reluctantly to become. His reintegration is not graceful, not triumphant, but achingly human, and in the gentle, lingering style of sleep stories, the narrative invites the listener to watch Draco take those first uneven steps toward belonging again. And so, just as Draco begins to settle awkwardly, uncomfortably, into the faint outline of a routine, the story glides into the next chapter of his reluctant professorship. If returning to Hogwarts had shaken old ghosts awake, then stepping into the classroom shakes the living ones. Wide-eyed first years with wands held like dangerous sticks, older students with overconfidence, bordering on catastrophic, and a man who absolutely did not sign up to supervise this level of chaos. Teaching, as it turns out, is far more perilous than anything Draco ever encountered on the battlefield. His lessons swing wildly between attempted structure and spectacular collapse. One moment he stands at the front of the room, posture straight, wand poised, voice crisp, very Snape, if Snape had ever looked like he desperately needed a holiday. The next moment, smoke billows from a student's wand, textbooks ignite, and someone's shield charm ricochets off a suit of armor with enough force to send it marching indignantly out the door. Draco's exasperation becomes an ongoing symphony. Long sighs, sharp mutters, and deadpan commentary that the students find either terrifying or hilarious. Maybe both. Yet beneath the irritation, something new flickers. He begins correcting wand grips more gently, explaining counter curses with unexpected clarity, and even more shocking, showing a flicker of pride when a particularly hapless second year finally casts a proper deflection spell. It is subtle, but it is there. The beginning of a shift from mere duty to genuine investment. This fragile progress leads Draco to a decision that is equal parts bold and ill-advised. Taking the first years into the Forbidden Forest for a practical lesson. The forest greets them with its usual symphony of rustling leaves and ancient breath, shadows stretching long like fingers across the undergrowth. Draco's voice carries authority as he warns them of dangers, though a small thrill hums beneath his ribs. This is the kind of magic he understands, the kind that feels real. When the Acromantula emerges, the scene splits open with cinematic clarity. The forest falls silent. The spider's massive legs crack against the earth. Students freeze, eyes wide, breaths held. And Draco moves before he even thinks. Spells snap through the air like silver lightning, each one precise and controlled. His commands are firm, steady, instinctive, and astonishingly, the students listen. They rally. They try. Their fear bends into determination as they mirror his stance and follow his lead. When the creature retreats at last, leaving only trembling knees and rapid breaths behind, the students look at Draco with something he has rarely seen directed toward him. Trust, respect, even admiration. He tries, of course, to shrug it off, to tell them they were reckless fools and he deserves hazard pay. But pride burns quietly beneath his words, warming a corner of him that has been cold for years. In this single, breathless moment, Draco begins to understand that teaching may not be the punishment he once believed. Perhaps, impossibly, it is the place where he might learn to begin again. And once the echoes of the Acromantula incident fade into the murmuring corridors of Hogwarts, the story slips gently into a new rhythm, one quieter, steadier, like snow beginning to fall after a night of thunder. The students who once stared at Draco with suspicion now watch him with a different light in their eyes, and though he pretends not to notice, something inside him begins to loosen, almost imperceptibly. The harrowing adventure has shifted something fundamental. Draco is no longer simply a man fulfilling a reluctant obligation. He is becoming, without meaning to, a teacher. The change is subtle at first. He still rolls his eyes dramatically when a first year melts yet another cauldron. He still insists, loudly and often, that he deserves hazard pay. But in the evenings, those once lonely stretches where he drowned himself in paperwork to avoid the weight of memory, he now finds himself lingering over lesson plans with unexpected curiosity. He experiments with new defensive techniques, rewrites explanations to be clearer, and even consults dusty old books he once swore he'd never touch again. There is a quiet pleasure in the craft of it, in the challenge, in the way the students progress, reflects his own. Among them, one stands out. Sammy Blackwood, a wiry Ravenclaw with sharp eyes and a remarkable instinct for counter-curses. Draco notices her potential long before she notices his praise. Their interactions are fleeting but meaningful. Draco's rare nod of approval, Sammy's astonished grin quickly masked beneath academic composure. These small exchanges illuminate a gentler layer of Draco he has spent years burying. The story uses these moments tenderly, showing how unlikely mentorship can bloom in the spaces where self-doubt once lived. As winter settles its silvery blanket over Hogwarts, the narrative slows into a more contemplative tone. The castle transforms into a haven of warmth against the cold. Fireplaces crackle in the staff lounge. Frost patterns glimmer across high windows, and the air smells faintly of cinnamon from the kitchens below. In this seasonal hush, Draco's emotional journey becomes even more pronounced. He begins to take part in staff conversations, awkwardly at first, but gradually with more ease. He finds himself laughing, just once or twice, and each time it surprises him more than anyone else. But healing is rarely linear. The Howler arrives on a quiet morning, ripping through the peace with vicious familiarity. Its condemning voice, dripping with old resentments, shakes Draco more than he will ever admit. The narrative handles this moment with soft hands, his rigid posture, his tight jaw, the way he pretends not to hear the whispers. Yet beneath this discomfort lies resilience. It is a fellow professor, the gruff potions master with unexpectedly wise counsel, who sits beside him afterward, offering steady, wordless support. This growing sense of community weaves through Draco's days like a slow-building warmth. The turning point arrives in Hogsmeade, where McGonagall meets him beneath drifting snowflakes. Her reassurance is simple but profound. His worth is not chained to his past. Her words settle into him like embers, glowing long after she leaves. He does not say he believes her, but for the first time, he wants to. And in that quiet wanting, the story reveals Draco's transformation. Not dramatic, not loud, but patient and deeply human, a man rediscovering belonging one small, courageous step at a time. And so, as the excitement of the Acromantula incident settles into school gossip and the rhythm of classes resumes, the story drifts gently into winter, an arrival so soft and gradual that even Draco does not realize how deeply it is changing him. Snow begins as a whisper against the high windows before thickening into drifting white curtains that weave gracefully between the castle's ancient towers. Frost forms delicate lace along the stone windowsills, catching the morning light like tiny constellations. Everywhere, fireplaces glow with steady, golden warmth, their crackling embers painting the halls with a comforting hush. This seasonal shift becomes a kind of emotional mirror, revealing the subtle thaw taking place within Draco himself. The man who once kept everyone at arm's length now finds himself invited, sometimes nudged, into the gentle rituals of Hogwarts life. He begins lingering in the staff lounge after meetings, allowing himself to be drawn into wizard chess matches he inevitably loses, much to the delight of a beaming charms professor. His sarcasm remains intact, sharp as ever, but it carries a lighter edge now, a warmth beneath the frost that others begin to recognize. Sammy Blackwood, his quick-witted Ravenclaw student, emerges as a quiet catalyst in this transformation. Her steady determination, her practiced wand work, and her earnest desire to improve remind Draco of a younger version of himself, the version he rarely allows himself to remember kindly. Their interactions grow subtly more intimate in emotional resonance. Lingering questions after class, shared observations about spell theory, small sparks of recognition that pass unspoken between mentor and student. One afternoon, Sammy hesitates at the door, her usual confidence frayed by self-doubt. She worries she isn't good enough, that her skill is luck rather than talent. Draco, surprising even himself, responds not with snark but with honesty. He confesses, in his roundabout Malfoy way, that he once squandered his potential through pride and carelessness, mistakes she is already surpassing simply by caring to improve. It is not a grand speech, not dramatic or sentimental, but the sincerity in his voice settles gently into the room like falling snow. It marks a turning point. Draco is no longer merely instructing, he is guiding, reassuring, believing. The winter chapters bathe Hogwarts in a kind of enchanted stillness. Holly wreaths float above doorways, candles glow with soft blue flames, and enchanted snowflakes drift continuously in the Great Hall. In this atmosphere of warmth and reflection, Draco begins to experience the castle not as a monument to shame, but as a place where he contributes, where he is quietly valued. Despite his best efforts to remain aloof, the narrative shows him slipping softly, subtly, into belonging. A shared joke over tea, a scarf left on his desk by a grateful student, a staff member saving him a seat near the fire. Hogwarts no longer feels like a sentence he must endure, but a season he is learning, slowly and tenderly, to embrace. And in the stillness of winter's embrace, Draco's heart, carefully armored for years, begins, at last, to thaw. And just as winter at Hogwarts begins settling into a peaceful rhythm, snow drifting lazily past frosted windows, Draco's days punctuated by small victories and unexpected warmth, the story introduces a ripple in that calm. It arrives not with drama, but with a memo, a very official, very unwelcome ministry memo. McGonagall reads it aloud at a staff meeting, her tone steady, though even she cannot quite hide the sigh buried at the end. A full ministry inspection of Hogwarts teaching staff. The room shifts with collective dread. Draco feels the familiar prickle of anxiety at the base of his spine, an old reflex he hoped had grown past. Inspections mean judgment. Bureaucrats, clipboards, people who believe they understand education simply because they've read the guidelines twice. He imagines them scrutinizing every detail. His lesson pacing, his tone, the angle of his wand when demonstrating defensive stances. Even the way he stands might be interpreted as intimidating or aloof, words he spent years trying to shake. He masks all this with trademark Malfoy sarcasm. Of course, perhaps they'll award points for emotional damage, he mutters. Someone nearby snorts into their teacup. But beneath the quips, the tightening in his chest betrays the truth. He wants to do well. He wants, unexpectedly, uncomfortably, to be seen as competent. And when the day arrives, The inspector, stepping into his classroom, is not the faceless bureaucrat Draco imagined. It is Hermione Granger. The revelation hits like a gust of cold air. Hermione stands poised and impeccably composed, quill hovering at the ready, her expression calm but unmistakably sharp. Draco's thoughts collapse into a jumble. Irritation, nostalgia, reluctant admiration, and a strange flutter he refuses to name. Their shared history stretches between them like an invisible thread, old rivalry, old misunderstandings, old wounds, and yet neither of them is who they once were. He straightens his posture, heart pounding a bit too loudly for comfort. Half of him wants to impress her. The other half wants to appear completely unaffected. Both halves, naturally, fail spectacularly. And yet, when he begins teaching, something remarkable happens. Draco rises to the moment. His instructions are brisk but clear, his demonstrations precise, his humor dry but well-timed. The students respond with enthusiasm, especially Sammy, who performs counter-curses with impressive finesse. Draco can feel Hermione's eyes on him, assessing, noting, perhaps even approving. When Sammy's shield charm blooms perfectly across the room, Hermione's raised eyebrows soften into the faintest smile. After class, Hermione interviews Sammy, who sings Draco's praises with unfiltered sincerity. Hearing himself reflected through the admiration of a student shakes something deep inside him, something that has been closed off for years. It is the first time he sees himself through a lens that is not clouded by shame. Their post-lesson conversation carries a familiar rhythm, sarcasm volleyed back and forth, but the sharpness of old rivalry is gone. In its place lingers something warmer, quieter, edged with mutual understanding. What began as a dreaded inspection becomes a milestone, not just in Draco's professional life, but in his emotional healing. Hermione's unexpected re-entry into his world becomes a mirror, revealing how far he has come and how much further he might dare to go. And so, after the unexpected warmth of Hermione's inspection and the quiet confidence it plants within him, the story drifts gently into the final stretch of the winter term, a time when Hogwarts seems to breathe with softer lungs, glowing warmly beneath its quilt of enchanted snow. For Draco, the days that follow unfold not as dramatic revelations, but as small, steady affirmations that he is no longer merely surviving his role. He is, in ways he scarcely admits, beginning to belong. His mornings shift first. What once began with reluctant sighs and muttered complaints now start with a brief pause at his window, where he finds himself watching the patterned frost or the gentle swirl of dawn snowflakes. His lessons take on a new polish, not because he fears scrutiny, but because he wants his students to understand what he knows, to feel capable, to feel safe. Even his humor softens, still sharp, but no longer designed to wound. It becomes something the students welcome, a familiar anchor amid the complexities of spellwork. The school mirrors this transformation. The Great Hall turns into a grand winter wonderland, ceiling charmed to release glittering flurries that vanish before they touch the tables. Towering Christmas trees sparkle with shifting colors, ornaments humming faint melodies. Draco, who once dismissed such decor as frivolous, finds himself lingering longer than intended, tracing the warm glow reflected on polished stone floors. His interactions with colleagues deepen as well. He joins conversations rather than orbiting their edges. He offers dry comments that make even the sternest professor smother a smile. And in turn, the staff treat him not as an outsider earning a second chance, but as one of their own. It is an unspoken shift, but Draco feels it with startling clarity. Yet healing is seldom uninterrupted. A howler arrives one morning, its voice booming, harsh condemnation through the Great Hall, accusing Draco of having no right to teach, no right to return, no right to change. The humiliation is immediate and scalding. Students freeze, staff members stiffen. Draco forces his face into a mask of indifference, but underneath, the old shame claws at him, whispering that perhaps the howler speaks the truth. But what follows overturns that fear. His colleagues move toward him, not away. The potions master claps a firm hand on his shoulder, muttering something gruff but supportive. McGonagall approaches with a gaze full of steadiness, her voice low and unwavering as she reassures him that growth is not invalidated by past mistakes. Their solidarity becomes a quiet shield, one Draco never expected to receive. A few days later, in the lantern-lit calm of Hogsmeade, he finds himself sharing butterbeer with McGonagall. Snow drifts outside the window, soft as breath. Draco admits indirectly, tentatively, that teaching has become something more than an obligation. McGonagall listens with gentle wisdom, reminding him that rebuilding a life is not about erasing the past, but transforming it into something that guides rather than chains. By the time the semester ends, Draco stands upon a threshold he never anticipated. Still cynical, still cautious, but carrying within him the faint, glowing ember of purpose. A fragile hope that Hogwarts, against all odds, may not simply be his past, but his beginning anew. And just as Draco's winter arc settles into a quiet hum of newfound purpose, the narrative shifts its lantern light toward another corner of Hogwarts, toward a younger heartbeat, a smaller story unfolding beneath the grandeur of ancient stones. This gentle turn feels intentional, like the narrator closing one chapter of healing before opening another that trembles with the fragile uncertainty of youth. Thus, we meet Alistair Verlerwood. Alistair enters the tale not with dramatic flourish, but with the soft ache of disappointment that clings stubbornly to his shoulders. A poorly executed transfiguration exam leaves him spiraling into self-doubt, cheeks burning, mind replaying every fumbled wand movement. His messy brown curls seem to frizz with frustration. His robes hang awkwardly on his lanky frame, as though he is growing faster than he can keep up with himself. He is painfully, earnestly adolescent, caught in that in-between place where childhood confidence fades and the expectations of adulthood loom too soon. The castle around him feels colder than before. Laughter echoes from groups of students planning weekend trips to Hogsmeade, but Alistair drifts past them like a ghost of his own confidence. Sleep Stories prose lingers on his isolation. The weight of unspoken fears, the quiet hunger for reassurance, the way disappointment settles into his chest like winter fog. Seeking escape, he heads toward the Slytherin common room, toward routine, familiarity, and the comfort of knowing he will soon meet his best friend, Carrie Valois, before their planned Hogsmeade trip. Carrie, bright and sharp and endlessly patient with him, is an anchor in his otherwise turbulent school life. Yet even the thought of her company cannot fully quiet the storm swirling inside his mind. Alistair's internal monologue flickers between determination and despair. I should be better by now. I need to get this right. Why can't I do it? These questions echo softly in the Sleep Stories cadence, capturing the universality of youthful pressure, the fear of not being enough, not living up to others' expectations or one's own. It is then, while wandering dimly lit corridors, that his path intersects with something unexpected. Passing by an open doorway, he overhears two professors discussing the sudden misplacement of a magical scarecrow's enchanted hat, an essential charm work piece needed to protect the pumpkin patch for the upcoming autumn feast. Without the hat, the feast and a beloved tradition may be at risk. The overheard exchange is brief, but it sparks something inside him. A small ember of responsibility, a flicker of courage. Perhaps, he thinks, he could help, not because he expects glory, but because he cannot bear the idea of disappointing yet another person or letting something small but important unravel. In that quiet moment, Alistair's arc begins its first real ascent, not through dramatic heroics, but through empathy, through the choice to care, even when he believes he has so little to offer. This chapter becomes the gentle prelude to his coming-of-age journey, a journey shaped not by grand spells, but by small acts of kindness, quiet bravery, and the earnest heart of a boy learning to trust himself. And so, carrying the faint spark of responsibility that had flickered to life in the corridor, Alistair drifts deeper into the castle, his steps tentative, his thoughts muddled, yet guided by an instinctive need to do something right for once. This gentle shift of intention leads him toward a place he seldom visits, but always finds comforting. The Hogwarts kitchens. It is a natural progression, as though the castle itself nudges him toward warmth after the chill of self-doubt. The moment he slips through the portrait entrance, the atmosphere transforms completely. Gone are the cold hallways and murmured anxieties. Here, the air glows with a golden, bustling coziness. Pots simmer with fragrant steam, enchanted pastries bob playfully in the air, and house elves zip between stoves with a kind of joyful efficiency unique to their craft. The sensory richness, the clatter of silverware, the sweet smell of treacle tart, the warmth radiating from enormous brick ovens seems to soothe the lingering tension in his chest. For the first time that day, Alistair exhales, without hearing doubt echo back at him. Wicket and Moulin, two elves had met during a past mishap involving exploding cocoa mugs, greet him with cheerful squeaks. Their familiarity anchors him, softening the embarrassment still clinging to him after his failed exam. He exchanges light-hearted banter with them, and even reaches perhaps a bit too boldly for a floating cream puff. Moulin playfully swats his hand away, earning a rare, sheepish grin from the boy. In the warm underbelly of the castle, he finally feels like someone allowed to take up space. But this levity fades when he notices a small figure curled in the back corner, shoulders quivering. Tilly, the youngest house elf in the kitchen, sits alone, her large eyes swollen with tears. The contrast between the bustling kitchen and her silent misery strikes Alistair with quiet urgency. Approaching her feels instinctive, almost gentle, as though he fears startling a bird with a broken wing. Her confession spills out in trembling bursts. She misplaced the Scarecrow's enchanted hat, the very hat that safeguards the pumpkin patch for the upcoming autumn feast. Without it, the protective magic is weakened, and the feast could be ruined, a disaster she believes unforgivable. Her sorrow is raw and genuine, painted with layers of guilt no young creature should shoulder alone. Alistair listens, really listens, something he often forgets he knows how to do. Instead of scolding or offering empty reassurances, he simply acknowledges her fear, her worry, and her desire to fix what she accidentally broke. And then, in a quiet moment that feels like the true beginning of his arc, he decides he will help her retrieve the hat. Not because he thinks he is capable, but because she shouldn't have to face this alone. The narrative lingers on this choice. Small, tender, and born from compassion. It becomes Alistair's first true step away from insecurity and toward agency. In helping Tilly, he also begins to help himself, discovering that even the smallest act of kindness can kindle courage in a heart that desperately needs it. And so, with Tilly's tearful confessions still echoing in his mind, Alistair steps back into the castle's dim corridors, carrying a responsibility that feels strangely heavier and yet, for the first time that day, not unwelcome. This gentle shift marks his transition from passive worry to deliberate action. Where earlier he had wandered Hogwarts burdened by self-doubt, now each step has a quiet purpose, as though the castle recognizes the change and hums softly in approval. He reminds himself that he isn't embarking on anything grand or world-saving. He is not Harry Potter facing dragons or dark wizards. No, Alistair Verlerwood is simply trying to help a house elf who is suffering under the weight of a small but significant mistake. Yet the modesty of the mission does not diminish its importance to him. The Scarecrow's enchanted hat protects the pumpkin patch that fuels the autumn feast, a celebration beloved by students and staff alike. And though the stakes are gentle, they hold profound meaning for a boy who longs to matter in even the smallest way. As he ventures deeper into the lesser-traveled hallways, the narrative leans into a more atmospheric tone, torchlight fluttering along stone walls, distant whispers of magic vibrating beneath his feet, enchanted suits of armor shifting as though watching over him. These quiet details do not frighten him. Rather, They heighten his sense that he is stepping into a Hogwarts-style quest of his own, one filled with the kind of subtle wonder he once believed reserved for other, braver students. His nerves flicker with every echoing footstep. Why me? What if I fail again? The old doubts rise, familiar and sharp. But unlike earlier that day, he doesn't allow them to stop him. Instead, he breathes through the unease, gripping his wand more tightly, not with confidence, but with determination. Sleep Story's narration captures this shift with soft clarity. Courage is not loud for Alistair. It trembles, but it persists. The castle seems to respond to this fragile bravery. Shadows stretch long, but not threateningly, more like guides pointing him forward. Arched doorways creak open as though expecting him. Even the air hums faintly with a kind of quiet encouragement, reminding him of Hogwarts' timeless ability to nurture growth in its own mysterious way. As Alistair follows faint clues, scratches along a doorframe, a trail of stray pumpkin seeds, the lingering magic of the scarecrow's missing enchantment, he begins sensing something unexpected. Possibility. The idea that maybe he can do something right, something meaningful, something good. Not because he excels in class, but because he cares deeply, and that caring itself might be a form of magic. This opening stage of his journey becomes a soft but powerful metaphor for the heart of his arc. Here, in torchlit corridors and quiet decisions, the truth begins to crystallize. Bravery isn't a blazing spell or a shouted incantation. It is a trembling hand, deciding to move forward. A boy choosing compassion over comfort. A student daring to believe he might matter. And with that quiet awakening, Alistair's quest truly begins. And just as Alistair's newfound resolve begins to steady his trembling steps, the universe, or perhaps simply Hogwarts' uncanny timing, decides he should not face this journey alone. He turns a corner, still clutching his wand a little too tightly, only to nearly collide with Carrie Valois, who stands with hands on hips and an expression that blends exasperation, concern, and unmistakable fondness. It is the kind of look only a true friend can give. What on earth are you doing? And why wasn't I invited? Carrie's presence shifts the atmosphere instantly. Where Alistair's quiet courage flickers uncertainly, Carrie's sharp intellect and natural boldness arrive like a steadying breeze. Before he can explain, she deduces half the situation from his anxious expression, and the rest from the dirt smudged on his sleeve. Her reaction is classic Carrie. A dramatic sigh, a muttered comment about Slytherins and their heroic complexes, and then a firm declaration that she's coming with him, end of discussion. Alistair tries to protest, mumbling something about danger, stolen hats, and the responsibility being his alone. But Carrie rolls her eyes in a way that manages to be both affectionate and infuriating. "If you think I'm letting you wander into trouble by yourself," she says, "then your self-esteem is even worse than your transfiguration grade." Her teasing cuts through his anxiety, grounding him in the familiar rhythm of their friendship. Together, they press deeper into the castle, two flickering wand lights tracing long shadows along ancient stone walls. The atmosphere transforms again, no longer heavy with solitary dread, but buoyed by the quiet joy of shared adventure. The enchanted suits of armor they pass seem almost amused, as though recognizing the timelessness of two young students scheming their way into trouble for a good cause. Their dynamic unfolds in warm, playful bursts. Carrie questions everything, every clue, every hunch, every corridor. Alistair insists they follow, yet she never questions him. This distinction becomes the emotional heartbeat of their interactions. Her confidence does not overshadow his resolve. Instead, it builds upon it, filling the spaces where he hesitates with encouragement, disguised as sarcasm. They bicker lightly over navigation. They whisper jokes to ease tension. At one point, a portrait scolds them for being out after hours, and Carrie, without missing a beat, sweet talks the painted knight into giving them directions. Alistair watches in awe, equal parts impressed and horrified. And yet, beneath the humor, something deeper unfolds. Carrie senses Alistair's lingering doubt about the quest, about himself, and gently counters it not with grand reassurances but with simple presence. When he pauses at a fork in the hallway, uncertain, she nudges his shoulder and whispers, "You've got good instincts. Lead the way." It is a small sentence, but for Alistair, it settles warm and steady in his chest. Together, they slip through shifting staircases, whispering halls, and enchanted doorways, their footsteps merging into a shared rhythm. Where Alistair brings empathy and instinct, Carrie brings logic and courage. Their strengths intertwine seamlessly, painting a portrait of a friendship built not on similarity but on balance. The quest no longer feels impossible, and Alistair, tentative, anxious, but now undeniably hopeful, takes another step toward becoming someone he never realized he could be. Carrie's unexpected arrival does more than steady Alistair's nerves. It gives the quest a sense of momentum, a shared purpose that carries them out of the castle corridors and toward the shadowed tree line of the Forbidden Forest. And it is here, at the threshold where moonlit snow melts into darkness, that their adventure shifts from light-hearted mischief to something deeper, more atmospheric. Alistair pauses, swallowing hard as the forest looms before them, its ancient branches interwoven like the ribs of some sleeping beast. Carrie, sensing his hesitation, gently bumps her shoulder against his. "We've come this far," she whispers, her voice soft but unwavering. "Let's keep going." And with that quiet encouragement, they step beneath the canopy as partners in courage. The forest greets them with a low hush, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures and the occasional creak of twisted boughs. Moonlight filters through gaps in the leaves, splintering across the mossy ground in silver shards. Though Alistair's heart pounds, he notices something surprising. Carrie's confidence seems to illuminate the darkness around them. She casts detection spells with crisp precision, each arc of light carving soft glimmers into the gloom. He trails behind, studying footprints, claw marks, and the subtle disturbances in brush and soil. For the first time, he realizes he has a gift for tracking an intuitive sense of movement, pattern, and subtle magical residue. But the forest is never predictable. An adventure rarely goes smoothly. When Carrie attempts a charm to reveal lingering enchantments, her wand sparks, sputters, and with a sudden pop, her brown curls transform into a magnificent explosion of luminous blue feathers. The sight is so ridiculous that even the forest seems to pause, as though holding back laughter. Carrie huffs, cross-eyed, as she tries to see the feathers, while Alistair dissolves into helpless giggles. After a moment of panic flipping through mental spell lists, he performs a careful counter-charm that, much to his own astonishment, restores her hair. Carrie blinks at him, equal parts relieved and impressed. "You're getting good at this," she murmurs, and the praise settles warm and glowing in Alistair's chest. As they move deeper into the woods, the atmosphere subtly changes. Luminescent fungi brighten in their presence, as if guiding them forward. Roots shift ever so slightly to clear a safer path. Even the wind seems to hum with recognition. The forest is not welcoming, exactly, but it isn't hostile either. It is watching, assessing this boy who arrived, trembling, and now walks with a steadier step. During a quiet moment, Alistair admits in a low voice why he is trying so hard. He doesn't want Tilly to feel the crushing disappointment he knows too well. Carrie listens, her features softening. She doesn't interrupt, doesn't tease. She simply nods, understanding the quiet shape of his heart better than he does. And so the forest search becomes more than a task. It becomes a mirror. In its shadows, Alistair confronts fear, self-doubt, and unexpected competence. With every step, he grows not by vanquishing monsters, but by discovering pieces of himself he never knew were there. The deepening confidence Alistair discovers within the Forbidden Forest becomes the quiet force that guides him and Carrie back toward the castle grounds, straight to the sprawling pumpkin patch that had started this entire journey. The shift in setting is immediate and striking. Where the forest had been shadowed and whispering, the pumpkin patch glows like an enchanted hearth under the moonlight. Towering pumpkins gleam with warm, ember-like radiance, each carved vein pulsing softly with stored magic. The vines curl and twitch as though listening, and at the very center stands the guardian scarecrow, slumped, dim, and flickering weakly without its enchanted hat. The sight tugs at Alistair's heart. The scarecrow looks strangely vulnerable, as though waiting for him. Carrie steps beside him, her voice lowering in awe. "We're close. I can feel it." And indeed, the air hums with restless mischief, the kind that suggests magical creatures have been meddling. It doesn't take long before a faint metallic clinking draws their attention to a mound of leaves trembling suspiciously. Alistair approaches cautiously, wand raised but not threatening, and with a gentle nudge of his boot, the mound erupts into chaos. A colony of nifflers bursts forth, plump, snuffling, irresistibly adorable little thieves whose tiny paws clutch treasures of every shape and shine. Buttons, coins, stray jewelry, a tarnished spoon, and right in the middle of their shimmering hoard rests the scarecrow's hat, glowing faintly with enchantment. Carrie groans with affectionate disbelief. Alistair laughs despite himself. The scene is ridiculous, chaotic, and utterly endearing, exactly the type of moment that softens fear and reminds him he is still just a boy on an adventure, not a hero in peril. Carrie tries logic first, offering an impassioned speech on property rights and magical necessity. The nifflers stare blankly before diving back into their pile. Alistair attempts gentle coaxing, kneeling, and speaking as though addressing shy children. No luck. Only when he reaches absent-mindedly for a bronze button dangling from his robe does everything change. The nifflers freeze, all eyes on the small, gleaming circle, and then swarm him in a frenzy of excited chirps. The trade is instantaneous. Button for hat, shiny desire outweighing all reason. Carrie bursts into laughter, equal parts triumphant and exasperated. "Of course, you solved it with a button." But her smile is proud, not mocking, and that pride warms Alistair more deeply than the pumpkin's glow. As he lifts the enchanted hat, the scarecrow stirs. The vines around it tighten protectively, and sparks of golden magic swirl upward like rising fireflies. When Alistair places the hat atop its head, the scarecrow straightens, its enchantments flaring back to life in a brilliant whirl of light. It bows once, solemnly, in silent acknowledgement of the boy who restored it. Then Tilly appears tearful, breathless, overwhelmed with gratitude. Her small voice cracks, and her emotions spill freely, thanking Alistair again and again. For him, something shifts permanently. This is not the hollow praise of exam scores. It is real, earned, meaningful. For the first time, he stands not as a struggling student, but as someone capable of making a difference. In that moonlit patch, surrounded by glowing pumpkins and swirling magic, Alistair steps fully into a new version of himself. Not perfect, but brave, kind, and quietly extraordinary. The restored scarecrow, swirling with renewed magic in the moonlit pumpkin patch, marks a triumphant end to Alistair's quest. But as he and Carrie make their way back toward the castle, the emotional weight of what he has accomplished settles in slowly, gently, like falling snow. The adrenaline fades, replaced by a warm, humming pride he can't quite name. Carrie walks beside him, swinging the empty buttonhole of his robe with dramatic flourish. "A noble sacrifice," she teases. "Your finest button for the good of Hogwarts." Her grin is bright, but her eyes carry something softer, unmistakable admiration. The laughter they share becomes the bridge that leads them from the quiet chaos of the patch to the dazzling glow of the great hall. Inside, the transformation is breathtaking. The autumn feast unfolds like a living tapestry of magic rows of pumpkins carved with dancing faces, golden leaves spiraling overhead on invisible currents, and floating jack-o'-lanterns blinking with warm, playful light. Platters of pumpkin pasties, cinnamon brioche, roasted squash, and steaming enchanted cider line the tables, filling the hall with sense of comfort and celebration. For everyone else, it is simply the yearly feast. For Alistair, it feels like a welcome he didn't know he had been waiting for. As he and Carrie slip into their seats, he senses a new steadiness in himself. The hall no longer feels intimidating or indifferent. Instead, it feels alive, buzzing with connection he had never thought himself part of. Carrie nudges him with the same elbow that had guided him into the forest. "You did it," she murmurs, the words soft but brimming with truth. And for the first time, Alistair doesn't deflect or deny. He lets the acknowledgement settle in his heart. Then Tilly appears. The small house elf stands on trembling feet, her eyes bright with gratitude as she bows so deeply her ears brush the floor. Her voice breaks as she thanks him, the words tumbling out in heartfelt waves. Around her, a cluster of house elves gathers, their admiration radiating so warmly that Alistair feels his cheeks burn crimson. Yet the feeling is wonderful, pure, unfiltered validation. Not for being exceptional, but for being kind, for trying. Before he has time to recover, Hemwick Abbott bursts into theatrical applause. With a booming voice and vine-covered hat wobbling precariously, he proclaims Alistair the honorary Pumpkin Prince. The hall erupts into laughter, and Carrie nearly falls off the bench in delight. Though Alistair wants nothing more than to sink beneath the table, he can't deny the glow blooming in his chest. The title may be absurd, but the affection behind it feels achingly real. As the feast continues, music swells, candles burn brighter, and the hall fills with warmth that seems to wrap around Alistair like a cloak he never knew he needed. His gaze drifts across the revelry, and he reflects not on his mistakes, nor on his anxieties, but on what he has gained. Courage discovered in small acts, friendship that's steadying his steps, and the quiet understanding that he belongs. By the time the final pumpkin lantern flickers goodnight, Alistair sits smiling softly, his triumph not loud but luminous, glowing from within, like a candle finally lit. The glow of the pumpkin feast still lingers in the great hall long after the celebration ends, leaving Hogwarts wrapped in a warm aftertaste of triumph, laughter, and soft candlelight. But as the narrative shifts beyond Alistair's quiet victory, the castle's attention gently drifts toward another first year, a boy far removed from the glow of confidence that now surrounds the newly crowned Pumpkin Prince. In this natural lull following festivity and fulfillment, the story opens its arms to someone who feels none of those things. Alfie Finnick, a quiet soul who walks the same corridors but sees a different Hogwarts entirely. Where Alistair struggled with fear and self-doubt until courage sparked within him, Alfie begins at a more fragile point, one defined not by anxiety or pressure, but by absence. Absence of excitement, absence of connection, absence of the awe that seems to come so easily to other students. While his peers gasp over levitating candles or squeal at their first broomstick ride, Alfie's reaction hovers somewhere between polite curiosity and faint bewilderment. He is not unimpressed, he simply does not feel the wonder that everyone insists he should. Born into a boisterous, wizarding family where magic flickers as casually as fireflies at twilight, Alfie is the lone, quiet ripple in a sea of exuberance. His siblings duel with leftover soup ladles. His cousins charm their way through birthday cakes. His parents set half the kitchen smoking at least twice a week with enthusiastic spell work. Yet Alfie watches all of it with gentle detachment, like someone observing a game whose rules he cannot quite grasp. He never resents it, just assumes he is built differently. as though a piece of him exists one step out of sync with his own world. This sense of emotional displacement follows him to Hogwarts. During classes, he sits at the edge of groups, his wand held correctly, but without conviction. He does everything asked of him, recites incantations, flicks his wrist, copies diagrams, yet the magic rarely responds in the way it should. To him, spells feel less like promises and more like puzzles missing a crucial piece. The narrative paints Alfie not as clumsy or defiant, but as quietly melancholic, a boy who moves at half speed in a world always rushing forward. He prefers solitary corners, shaded courtyards, or slow walks along the lakeshore. His mind is rich. He notices patterns in ripples on the water, hears the slight pitch changes in enchanted bells, and memorizes the way sunlight bends through high windows. But none of that helps him cast even the simplest charm. This emotional distance from magic resonates because it echoes a universal ache. The fear of being the odd one out, even in places meant to feel like home. Alfie is not mocked or excluded. He is simply misplaced in a world that celebrates exactly what he struggles to embody. Yet the story does not frame him as lacking. Instead, it lays the careful groundwork for a coming-of-age arc centered on belonging, self-discovery, and redefining what it means to be magical. Alfie's introduction is soft and understated, but the emotional stakes run deep. His journey will not revolve around mastering spells or dazzling crowds. It will be about uncovering the kind of strength that exists entirely outside wandwork. As Hogwarts shifts toward winter's embrace, and the halls echo with the footsteps of braver, louder students, Alfie walks quietly behind them, carrying within him the quiet, extraordinary truth that even the boy who feels the least magical may one day shine in ways he cannot yet imagine. Following Alfie Finnick's quiet introduction, the narrative shifts naturally from who he is to what he endures, allowing readers to understand the depth of his internal conflict. While other students find Hogwarts magical, even intoxicating, Alfie's days unfold with a kind of gentle dread, each class presenting a new opportunity to confirm the fear that has begun to coil itself tightly around his young heart. Where Alistair's journey blossomed from insecurity into courage, Alfie's begins with the slow erosion of self-belief, a contrast that enriches the emotional texture of the story. The first signs appear in charms, where the lesson should have been simple: light a candle, dim a candle, relight a candle. Yet Alfie's wand seems to betray him. Instead of producing a warm spark, it absorbs the room's glow entirely, plunging the class into accidental darkness. The laughter is kind, not mocking, but it still hits him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of self-doubt across his mind. Transfiguration is no better. While even the most nervous first years manage a slight twitch of transformation, his matchstick remains stubbornly unchanged, as though defying him on purpose. Professor McGonagall is patient, her corrections gentle, yet to Alfie, her watchful eyes feel like spotlights revealing every flaw he wishes he could hide. But the true blow lands during herbology, a class famous for being forgiving to students who struggle with spellwork. When Alfie attempts a muffling charm on a particularly irritable mandrake, the plant only screams louder, as if amplifying his failure for the entire greenhouse to hear. Professor Longbottom rushes to intervene, but Alfie hears only the pounding of his own heartbeat, loud and accusing. These mishaps, though small, gather weight like snow, piling quietly on a branch. Each one whispers a version of the same terrible message: you don't belong here. His professors mean well, offering reassurance and encouragement, yet their support only deepens the ache inside him. How do you explain the guilt of disappointing people who believe so fiercely in your potential? His classmates, too, do their best to be kind. Some offer tips, others share stories of their own magical blunders. But their optimism, "you'll get it next time," only sharpens Alfie's fear that there won't be a next time where he succeeds. He begins shrinking into himself, withdrawing from conversations, walking the halls with lowered eyes. Even meals in the Great Hall feel overwhelming, the chatter and excitement like waves he cannot swim through. The heart of Alfie's struggle lies not in the spells he fails to cast, but in the beliefs he begins to form about himself. The narrative captures his internal monologue with painful clarity. The soft, persistent worry that something inside him is broken, that he is an ordinary boy misplaced in an extraordinary world. This emotional landscape lays the foundation for his metamorphosis. His failures are not just moments of embarrassment, they are turning points, each one quietly shaping the boy he will become. In the shadow of these early disappointments, the spark of his eventual strength waits, small but unextinguished. And just when Alfie's quiet despair seems to settle into something dangerously permanent, the narrative shifts toward a moment that, though wrapped in chaos, becomes the unlikely hinge on which his entire arc pivots. His struggles in earlier classes had chipped slowly, silently at his confidence, but defense against the dark arts delivers the blow that forces everything inside him to crack open. Yet paradoxically, it is in that breaking that transformation begins. The lesson starts innocently enough. Draco Malfoy, whose patience has improved only marginally since becoming a professor, instructs first years on water-based defensive spells. His demonstration is crisp and effortless, a thin stream of water arcing neatly from one tip to target dummy. Students murmur with admiration, wands raised eagerly. The classroom hums with anticipation, laughter, and the usual undercurrent of chaos inherent to any first-year spell practice. But Alfie feels none of the excitement. Standing in the back row, he grips his wand with clammy fingers, stomach tight with the familiar dread of failure. Still, he tries. He always tries. At first, nothing happens, not even a spark. And for a breath, Alfie allows himself the tiniest sigh of relief. Failure in silence is better than failure in spectacle. But then his wand explodes into life. A violent jet of water blasts from the tip, roaring like a burst pipe. The force sends Draco stumbling backward, crashing into a stack of practice shields. Students shriek, ducking as the rogue geyser ricochets wildly around the room. What should have been a trickle becomes a flood, soaking robes, knocking books from desks, and turning the polished classroom floor into a miniature river. Draco, drenched and furious, tries to intervene, but every counterspell he fires only multiplies the chaos, redirecting the water into spiraling arcs and sideways fountains. It becomes clear, within seconds, that this is no ordinary mishap. Alfie's accidental magic is powerful, untamed, and shockingly persistent. Professors arrive from neighboring corridors, alarmed by the torrent pouring beneath the classroom door. It takes several adults, a combined web of counter-charms, and the better part of 5 minutes to neutralize the spell. When the final jet sputters out, what remains is a drenched, breathless cohort of students, and one boy who wishes he could sink through the floor entirely. Alfie trembles under the weight of humiliation. He apologizes so rapidly, so desperately, that even Draco, still toweling water from his hair, pauses. Though irritation flashes across his face, beneath it lies something else: recognition. Draco knows what it is to fail publicly, to be stared at, to drown in shame thicker than water. And that quiet understanding softens him in ways he never verbalizes. Students gather around Alfie, not with ridicule, but with amazement. No one had expected that kind of magic from the quiet, unremarkable boy who barely got a spark out of Lumos. Their surprise becomes the first crack in the narrative Alfie has been writing about himself. For while Alfie views the episode as catastrophic proof that he doesn't belong, the story subtly reframes the moment as a revelation. Not incompetence, but power. Not failure, but a beginning, wild, messy, and unintentional, yet undeniably significant. In the wake of disaster, a new possibility stirs. That Alfie's place in the wizarding world may not lie in predictable success, but in a magic uniquely his own. In the stunned, waterlogged quiet that follows the chaotic defense against the dark arts disaster, something subtle but fundamental begins to shift inside Alfie Finnick. Where embarrassment once swelled like a storm tide, the absence of ridicule now creates an unexpected hollow one the boy doesn't quite know how to fill. And yet, into that silence slips the first fragile seed of change. If the catastrophe was the breaking point, then the days that follow become the soft, steady unfolding of what he is yet to understand about himself. It begins when he realizes the world has not, in fact, ended. Students still wave at him in corridors. No one snickers behind his back. Draco doesn't assign extra detention, nor does he glare with the disdain Alfie expected. Instead, life simply goes on. Hogwarts hums with its usual warmth and unpredictability, as if gently reminding Alfie that one disastrous spell does not define a person's worth. This unexpected kindness becomes the soil in which Alfie's first lesson about himself begins to grow. Maybe failure isn't as catastrophic as he imagined. For the first time, he wonders, hesitantly, cautiously, whether his value might lie somewhere other than the tip of his wand. As this idea softens within him, he starts noticing things he had been too anxious to see before. The castle itself seems to reveal small mercies. House elves offer him extra servings of pumpkin bread without being asked. Friends laugh with him about the incident, imitating the water spray with fond dramatization rather than ridicule. He even catches Draco smothering a reluctant smirk when a student jokes that Alfie could single-handedly refill the Black Lake if it ever ran dry. These moments do not inflate Alfie's confidence, they anchor it, quietly, patiently. He begins helping in ways that have nothing to do with spellwork. When a Hufflepuff loses her notes, Alfie organizes her scattered parchment with meticulous care. When two Gryffindors panic before a test, he offers calm reassurance, guiding them through the material with clarity even he doesn't realize he possesses. He carries books for overwhelmed classmates, restores toppled potion ingredients to their shelves, and lends a listening ear to anxious first years who find Hogwarts both wonderful and terrifying. Without planning to, Alfie becomes a stabilizing presence someone others instinctively lean toward when they need grounding rather than spectacle. His empathy, patience, and quiet logic begin to shine in ways no charm ever could. And slowly, Alfie sees it too. He notices that where magic falters, his creativity steps forward. When spells confuse him, his practical problem-solving fills the gap. While classmates rely on magical shortcuts, Alfie sees patterns, steps, and connections they often overlook. What once felt like inadequacy now begins to feel strangely like difference, not deficiency. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, he allows himself to contemplate a revolutionary possibility. That belonging is not earned through mastery of magic, but through the uniqueness one brings to the world. In this newfound perspective, Alfie's journey shifts from self-reproach to self-recognition. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with the gentle, persistent truth that even without perfect spellwork, he is valuable, needed, significant, and perhaps, in ways no one yet realizes, including himself, extraordinary. Alfie's newfound perspective, this delicate, growing sense that he may have value beyond spellcasting, barely has time to take root before Hogwarts throws him into yet another whirlwind. But this time, unlike the chaos of the defense disaster, what follows does not break him. Instead, it reveals the quiet bravery that had been waiting beneath all his self-doubt. And fittingly, it begins in the very same classroom that had once drowned him in humiliation. The scene starts innocently enough. Draco assigns a simple charm exercise meant to strengthen wand control. Students pair off. Chatter fills the room. And for once, Alfie feels only mild apprehension rather than dread. Yet before the lesson can settle into routine, one overly enthusiastic Ravenclaw flicks her wand with too much flourish, and the charm, meant to replicate a single droplet, multiplies uncontrollably. In moments, The floor is shimmering with spreading puddles. In seconds, those puddles become waves. Within minutes, pandemonium reigns. Desks lift off the floor, drifting like boats. Textbooks bob helplessly. Wet robes cling to shivering legs as first years scream, slip, scramble, or wildly flail through mounting water. Spells are misfiring everywhere, some weakening the flood, others accidentally strengthening it. The room becomes a miniature indoor sea, churning and rising with unnerving speed. Draco shouts instructions, then curses under his breath when a wave splashes into his face. And in the midst of that spiraling chaos, something truly extraordinary happens. Alfie does not freeze. Where another student might panic, Alfie moves instinctively, decisively, with a clarity he has never felt before. His wand stays pocketed. Instead, he sprints toward a toppled rack of broom paddles, left over from a recent lesson on aquatic creatures. Grabbing one, he uses it like a guiding oar, pushing desks toward students who have become stranded on floating islands of wood and fabric. "Keep moving this way! Don't! Fight the current! Go with it!" he shouts, surprising even himself with the authority in his voice. And remarkably, people listen. He creates pathways where the water is deepest, wedges furniture in place to form stepping platforms, and shepherds terrified classmates toward higher ground. His movements are quick and practiced, as though his instincts have known all along how to lead in moments where magic fails. Even Draco stops mid-incantation, frozen in disbelief. His wand hovers uselessly as he watches Alfie coordinate the evacuation with the natural competence of someone far older and far more confident than the boy he thought he knew. When the rising pressure threatens to burst the door outward, Alfie doesn't hesitate. He lunges forward, bracing his entire body against it, gritting his teeth as water slams against the wood. His strength holds long enough for Professor Sinistra to burst in and siphon the water away with a sweeping, elegant spell that drains the room in seconds. The silence that follows is deep and breathless. The students are soaked. Draco is stunned. Alfie is trembling with exertion. Then the cheers begin. They swell from scattered voices into a unified roar. Relief, admiration, gratitude. And at the center of it stands Alfie Finnick. No magic, no charm, no wand work, just courage. In that moment, his story crystallizes. He does not need to be extraordinary in the ways others expect. His worth shines brightest in the gaps where magic cannot reach. And for the first time, Alfie truly believes he belongs. The flooding incident would have left most first years shaken. But for Alfie Finnick, it becomes something far stranger, a spotlight he never asked for and certainly never wanted. In the days that follow, the chaos of the classroom transforms into a school-wide legend, retold with increasingly wild embellishments. And because this is Hogwarts, where gossip spreads faster than broomsticks, Alfie's name is suddenly everywhere. What began as a desperate attempt to stop desks from drifting into danger becomes, in the retellings, a mythical feat of bravery. At breakfast, Alfie overhears a Gryffindor announcing that he lifted 3 students at once. In the library, a Ravenclaw insists he used advanced Muggle engineering to redirect the water's current. By lunchtime, someone claims Alfie summoned a lifeboat using pure willpower. Each exaggeration makes his stomach tighten a little more. The attention feels almost worse than the disaster itself. Where others might have basked in the glory, Alfie shrinks from it with visible discomfort. Compliments twist like knots in his chest, and praise makes him wish he could disappear behind a tapestry. His friends tease him gently. Toby reenacts the whole flood with dramatic splashing motions. Pippa sketches ludicrous heroic portraits of Alfie wielding a trident, but beneath the humor, they see the strain building in him. Alfie insists he did nothing remarkable. "I just didn't want anyone to drown," he murmurs, cheeks warm with embarrassment. Ironically, this humility only reinforces his classmates' admiration. Soon, even the professors begin watching him with new curiosity. Their eyes linger longer. as though re-evaluating a student they previously overlooked. Their smiles hold a hint of something more, expectation? Confusion? Wonder? Alfie cannot tell, and he doesn't want to. Even Draco Malfoy reacts differently. He does not shower Alfie with praise. That would be too un-Malfoy a thing to do, but his sharp eyes soften slightly whenever Alfie enters the room. He speaks to him with a tone barely perceptible, but unmistakably gentler. It is not approval, exactly, but recognition. Draco knows what it means to fail publicly, and perhaps he knows, too, what it means to rise from such failure in unexpected ways. Yet Alfie struggles with what this sudden shift means for his identity. For so long, his internal question had been, am I magical enough? Now the whispers of admiration leave him grappling with a new uncertainty. If I am a hero, what does that make me? He never wanted to stand out. He never wanted expectations placed upon him, especially not expectations shaped by inflated stories of heroism. Admiration, he discovers, can feel just as heavy as failure, just as overwhelming. But beneath that discomfort, another seed is quietly planted. If people see something special in him, something that has nothing to do with spells or wands, then maybe, just maybe, he is capable of becoming someone he never imagined. Someone whose worth is defined not by magic, but by the person he chooses to be. It is the first time Alfie truly wonders if the world sees more in him than he has ever seen in himself. Although the classroom flood marks a personal turning point for Alfie, the true consequences of his unexpected bravery only become clear in the days that follow, and they begin with a ripple of whispers that quickly swell into school-wide legend. It starts innocently enough, a pair of excited second years discussing the Hufflepuff who saved everyone. Then a group of Gryffindors reenacting the scene with dramatic splashes, and by the end of the evening the entire castle seems to hum with the tale. What had felt to Alfie like a frantic, instinct-driven scramble is transformed in retellings into something almost heroic. By breakfast the next morning, the story has evolved beyond recognition. Some students claim he carried 3 drowning classmates at once. Others insist he used advanced Muggle engineering principles to redirect the flood. A particularly imaginative Ravenclaw swears they saw him summon a full-sized lifeboat out of sheer willpower. And though each exaggeration pushes Alfie further from the truth, they push him deeper into unwanted fame. For a boy who preferred being unnoticed, the attention is suffocating. Compliments make him flinch. Admiring looks send him retreating behind stacks of books or ducking into alcoves. Even praise spoken kindly feels like pressure, as though everyone expects him to be someone he never intended to become. His friends, Toby with his endless teasing, Pippa with her over-the-top heroic sketches, mean well, but even their affection highlights a reality Alfie isn't ready to face. Hogwarts sees him differently now. The professors notice too. Their glances linger longer. Their questions become gentler, more probing. It isn't suspicion, it's curiosity. A sense of quiet evaluation, as if they are trying to understand what lies beneath Alfie's shy exterior. Draco Malfoy, though maintaining his usual cool reserve, watches Alfie with a subtle shift of tone, a quiet respect he never states aloud, but cannot fully hide. Even for Draco, who has seen more than most, Alfie's courage had been undeniable. Yet this new admiration brings a new conflict. For months, Alfie's greatest fear had been that he wasn't magical enough. Now, confronted with constant praise, he finds himself asking a different question entirely. What does this make me now? The hero narrative others build around him feels foreign, almost absurd. He doesn't feel changed, let alone transformed into someone remarkable. Still, beneath his discomfort, something fragile and hopeful stirs. If people see strength in him, strength he didn't know he possessed, then perhaps he is not as out of place in the wizarding world as he once believed. Perhaps courage can come from instinct rather than spell work, and perhaps value can exist beyond magical skill. It is the smallest shift, barely noticeable even to Alfie himself, but it marks the beginning of a new chapter, one where he slowly, cautiously, starts imagining that he might matter not because he is powerful, but because he is good. If Hogwarts had turned Alfie into a reluctant hero, the outside world, particularly his family, was determined to turn him into a full-fledged legend. And naturally, the news didn't travel through official channels or carefully written school letters. Instead, it followed the whimsical, slightly absurd route that gossip always seemed to prefer. A distant cousin in Kent heard it from a neighbor, who heard it from a shopkeeper, who allegedly overheard a group of Hogwarts students buying cauldron cakes. By the time the owl landed in the Finnick household, Alfie's simple act of bravery had transformed into a myth involving life-threatening whirlpools, daring rescues, and at least one giant squid cameo. Unaware of the chaos unfolding back home, Alfie carried on as quietly as he could until the morning he received a letter so energetic it seemed ready to leap off the parchment and hug him. His mother's handwriting swooped across the page in glittering ink glitter she had somehow glued to the parchment herself, celebrating her darling, heroic Alfie. She covered the margins with star stickers, broomstick doodles, and a surprisingly detailed drawing of him battling a tidal wave. Alfie read it tucked into his secret library nook, cheeks burning, torn between deep affection and a desperate wish to hide under the nearest table. Before he recovered, a second letter arrived, this one from his father, whose humor softened the embarrassment but offered no escape from the affection. Thinking of making badges that say, "Alfie the Great," he wrote. "Let me know how many I should order. The neighbors are already lining up." He asked, half-jokingly, whether Alfie had considered a future in magical emergency response, despite the fact that his son still struggled to produce a spark charm without accidentally blowing out nearby candles. The contrast between Alfie's self-perception and his parents' overflowing pride forms one of the story's warmest threads. While Alfie still replayed each awkward moment, focusing on how frightened he'd been and how clumsy he thought he looked, his parents saw only courage, kindness, and instinct. Their letters, equal parts chaotic, heartfelt, and unintentionally comedic, became a soft counterweight to his insecurity. Of course, Alfie tried to keep the letters secret, but secrets rarely survive long among close friends, especially when Toby snatched one straight from Alfie's hands and collapsed into dramatic laughter upon reading, "Our heroic pumpkin pie." Millie wiped tears of laughter from her cheeks. Pippa immediately began sketching Alfie in heroic armor made entirely of stickers. Yet beneath the teasing lay genuine tenderness. They didn't laugh at him, they laughed with him, pulling him into a circle of warmth he hadn't known he needed. These letters, and his friends' affectionate reactions, help Alfie understand something vital. Heroism isn't about spectacle or grandeur. It isn't about perfect wand work or dazzling skill. Sometimes, it's simply a matter of caring enough to act, even when you're scared. His parents, with their glitter, jokes, and unwavering faith, saw the truth before he did. And slowly, their pride began to plant a seed inside him. Not the pressure to be great, but permission to believe he already was. If the letters from home gave Alfie warmth, it was the Hufflepuff common room that finally gave him breath. After days of unwanted stares, whispered praise, and classmates reenacting the classroom flood with increasingly theatrical splashes, Alfie needed somewhere stable, somewhere soft. Fortunately, Hufflepuff was built for softness, and so, naturally, it became the place where his racing thoughts could slow down to a pace that matched his heart. Tucked behind the familiar row of kitchen barrels, the entrance led into a room glowing with the gentle gold of enchanted lanterns. Earthy scents, wood polish, warm bread, hints of herb soil wrapped around him like a blanket. The room's rounded edges and low ceilings made everything feel safe, as though the castle itself was leaning down to whisper, "You're okay here." After the flood incident, stepping inside felt like sinking into a warm chair after standing in the rain. Yet what truly grounded Alfie was not the comfort of the room, but the people in it. Unlike the rest of Hogwarts, where curiosity buzzed around him like startled pixies, Hufflepuffs treated him with quiet, effortless acceptance. They didn't ask for heroic retellings or magical demonstrations. They didn't look at him with awe or tension. Instead, they simply shifted aside so he could squeeze into an armchair and handed him a pumpkin puff without saying a word. It was the kind of kindness that didn't demand anything in return. His friends quickly gravitated to the space too, Toby plopping dramatically onto a beanbag, Pippa spilling half her colored pencils across the carpet, and Millie sliding in with a stack of books taller than her head. Their presence turned the already cozy room into something even warmer, something undeniably his. They would spend entire evenings debating topics so nonsensical that Alfie found himself laughing before he even understood the point. Subjects like which magical creature would make the worst dinner guest, and whether a merperson could technically win a foot race. Gradually, Alfie built small routines that stitched themselves into the rhythm of his days. Studying by the crackling fireplace, sharing pastries smuggled in by the house elves, who had taken a special liking to him, listening to older students explain spells with patience rather than pity. No one expected him to cast perfectly. No one judged. They simply existed with him, and that simple coexistence felt like healing. The turning point came when a group of younger Hufflepuffs gathered around him, fascinated by the tiny handheld muggle game he absent-mindedly played during a break. Suddenly, Alfie, awkward, quiet Alfie, was the expert. He taught them how to plant pixelated gardens and build tiny block houses, and their faces lit up with genuine delight. For the first time, admiration didn't make him shrink. It made him smile. In that moment, Alfie realized something profound. Belonging didn't come from impressing others. It came from being seen and accepted exactly as he was. The Hufflepuff common room didn't transform him, it allowed him to recognize himself. Here, finally, he didn't feel like an odd piece in the magical puzzle. Here, he fit. Yet even the warmth of the Hufflepuff common room could not slow the turning of seasons, and soon the castle itself began to shift into that soft, wistful rhythm that always marked the end of a school year. After months of stumbling, learning, failing, surprising himself, and slowly stitching his place into Hogwarts, Alfie found the world around him settling into a gentle hush, as though encouraging him to take one last look before stepping briefly away. And so, with the quiet bravery he had earned piece by piece, Alfie began reflecting on the year that had shaped him more than he ever expected. He walked the corridors with a new kind of awareness, noticing how the portraits, once intimidating in their grand, sweeping frames, now greeted him with familiar nods or sleepy waves. The suits of armor, which used to clang ominously whenever he passed, seemed to do so now in absent-minded rhythm rather than judgment. Even the staircases, notoriously moody, shifted beneath his feet with surprising cooperation, as if acknowledging that Alfie Finnick was no longer a stranger learning the castle's moods, but a boy the castle recognized. From there, his steps carried him into the Great Hall. The vaulted ceiling mirrored a warm, late spring sky, and Alfie stood for a moment beneath it, remembering almost with disbelief his trembling first dinner at Hogwarts. Head felt swallowed back then by noise, magic, expectation. Now the same space felt spacious instead of overwhelming, vast instead of threatening. He took a seat at the empty Hufflepuff table and let the quiet wrap around him like a quilt, grateful for how far he had come. His reflections naturally guided him to the classrooms that had once felt like arenas of failure. In Charms, he lingered by the windows, where he had extinguished every candle in a single, impressively disastrous swoop. In Herbology, he hovered by the workstation, where his mandrake had stubbornly refused to calm down, despite his increasingly frantic attempts. In Transfiguration, his matchstick remained in memory, aggressively matchstick-like. But as he retraced these moments, something surprising happened. He smiled, not in triumph, but in acceptance. These stumbles were no longer weights dragging him down, they were footsteps marking the beginning of a much longer journey. The most profound shift came when he stood before the library window, the place where he had hidden after the defense disaster, bracing himself for judgment that never truly arrived. His reflection looked the same: soft features, shy eyes, gentle posture, but beneath that familiarity lived something new: resilience, a quiet confidence, and a steadiness he had earned through kindness, courage, and survival. His nook no longer felt like an escape, but a sanctuary he had grown into. And then came his end-of-year report. Mediocre spellwork, yes, some areas still below expectations, but beside those were notes that glowed brighter than any charm. Excellent teamwork, remarkable creativity, dependable under pressure, and finally, the line that made his chest ache with something tender commended for exceptional problem-solving under duress. Hogwarts, in its own structured, formal way, had written him a message. We see you. You matter. Packing his trunk was unexpectedly emotional. The castle hummed softly around him, as though reluctant to let him go. But instead of dread, Alfie felt an almost hopeful longing, a desire to return, to continue growing, to keep discovering what his place in this world could be. His understanding of belonging had shifted entirely. It wasn't about matching others. It was about being valued for the things only he could offer. For the first time, Alfie Finnick didn't feel like a visitor in a magical world. He felt like someone who truly belonged to it. And yet, as naturally as the tide retreats from the shore, the end of term arrived, carrying Alfie toward the moment he had once dreaded, leaving Hogwarts. But unlike the anxious, uncertain boy who had clung to the walls of the castle on his first day, Alfie stepped onto the platform for the homeward journey with a steadiness born from everything he had endured, survived, and quietly conquered. The transition from reflection to departure felt gentle rather than abrupt, as though the castle itself were giving him a soft nudge forward, not pushing him out, but sending him home. The Hogwarts Express chugged beneath a pastel sky, the countryside unfolding in broad strokes of green and gold. Alfie watched the landscape roll by, his breath settling into an easy rhythm. Across from him, Pippa animatedly reenacted a duel between two imaginary magical chickens, while Toby and Millie argued about whether next year's electives would include basic hex safety or intermediate disaster prevention special focus on first years named Alfie. Instead of shrinking under their teasing, Alfie laughed, the sound unburdened and real. Their affection no longer embarrassed him. It comforted him in ways he didn't fully understand, but deeply valued. At one point, Alfie took out his handheld Muggle console, a familiar anchor of home. But this time, he didn't hunch over it like a shield. He held it up for his friends to see, teaching Millie how to navigate a pixelated forest and showing Toby where the secret treasure was hidden. The small, glowing screen illuminated their faces, their laughter blending with the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels. Alfie realized he was no longer using the game to hide from the world. He was inviting the world in. When the train slowed into King's Cross, Alfie tensed instinctively, out of old habit, but the moment he stepped off the carriage, he saw his parents waiting for him, as if he were the most extraordinary boy in the entire station. His mother's enthusiastic waving was so wild, it nearly smacked an unsuspecting wizard, and his father held a sign painted quite badly with the words, "Welcome home, hero," complete with a lopsided drawing of Alfie holding a broom like a battle axe. Alfie's face flushed crimson, but the warmth blooming in his chest was undeniable. Their pride, once overwhelming, now felt steadying proof that even outside Hogwarts, he was loved for who he was, not for what he could or could not do. As they walked home, the noise of the station fading behind them, his parents bombarded him with questions, jokes, and half-serious plans for summer hero training. Alfie responded with laughter, stories, and a newfound confidence threading through his words. For the first time, he wasn't trying to hide the difficult moments. He wasn't ashamed of the flood incident or his struggles. Instead, he told the stories fully: chaos, courage, and all. And somewhere between his father's playful jokes and his mother's delighted gasps, Alfie realized something profound. He didn't need to be extraordinary to make a difference. He simply needed to be himself, kind, steady, creative, brave in the moments that mattered. Hogwarts had given him challenges, friends, fear, triumph, and above all, belonging. And when he returned next year, he would not return as a boy trying to fit a mold. He would return as Alfie Finnick, ordinary, wonderful, and ready. Just as Alfie's quiet transformation brings a gentle close to the school year, the narrative widens its lens, inviting the reader to step back and see the tapestry woven across the lives of all three central characters. What at first appeared to be separate threads, Draco's haunted adulthood, Alistair's tempestuous adolescence, and Alfie's tender search for belonging, slowly reveal themselves as parts of a deliberately structured triad. Their stories do not simply coexist. They resonate, forming a layered exploration of what it means to grow within a magical world. In this way, Alfie's departure becomes the perfect doorway to this broader reflection. Draco stands at the eldest edge of the triad, a man burdened by the weight of a past he cannot undo. His journey is not about discovering magic, but about reconciling with the ways it shaped and scarred him. Teaching at Hogwarts forces him into daily confrontation with who he once was, yet it also grants him the smallest opportunities for redemption. A corrected essay, a calm word during a crisis, the careful molding of a future generation he hopes will be braver, kinder, less lost than he once was. His arc embodies the painful but courageous task of rewriting one's legacy. Alistair, positioned squarely in the middle, becomes the embodiment of transition itself. His failures sting sharply, his victories feel fragile, and his emotions surge with the volatility inherent to youth. He is the stage of identity defined by questions rather than answers. Who am I becoming? What do others see in me? What if I'm not enough? Through him, the narrative captures the unpredictable intensity of adolescence, when every success feels monumental and every stumble feels catastrophic. Alistair is not yet who he will become, but the story honors the rawness of this liminal stage. Alfie, the youngest of the trio, offers the quietest yet most profound counterbalance. Where Draco's arc is heavy with memory and Alistair's bursts with restless energy, Alfie's grows through gentleness, sincerity, and the courage of simply existing. He is not striving for power. He is not trying to outrun a past. He is simply learning to belong to others, to Hogwarts, and to himself. His arc suggests a radical truth. Magical worth is not measured in spellwork, but in humanity. In Alfie's world, the quietest boy can hold the greatest heart. When placed together, these arcs create a resonant spectrum of identity. Draco's cautious pride in his students mirrors Alfie's disbelief in his own strengths. Alistair's frantic desire to prove himself echoes Draco's early hunger for validation. Alfie's resilience reflects the vulnerability Draco has learned to keep hidden. Each boy becomes, unintentionally, a reflection of the others. Through this triad, the narrative delivers its most elegant message. Magic is not merely a tool, it is a mirror. It magnifies fear, courage, regret, and hope. It reveals who each character is beneath the surface and who they might yet become. By weaving Draco, Alistair, and Alfie into parallel emotional journeys, the story transforms from a simple tale into a layered meditation on identity across time. Having established the elegant narrative triad formed by Draco, Alistair, and Alfie, the story naturally widens its thematic focus, revealing how their intertwined journeys illuminate the deeper emotional architecture of the tale. Their parallel arcs, so distinct yet resonant, pave the way for a broader examination of the three central themes that pulse beneath the narrative surface: belonging, redemption, and the quiet but transformative power of ordinary courage. Belonging emerges first. Not as a destination, but as a journey, each character must navigate in profoundly different ways. Draco, returning to the castle he once haunted as a symbol of fear and prejudice, confronts the possibility that Hogwarts might not welcome him back, or worse, that he might not deserve that welcome. Yet as he teaches, falters, endures, and tries again, he discovers that belonging does not demand perfection. It requires sincerity. In contrast, Alistair grapples with the sharp-edged teenage terror of not being enough, not skilled enough, brave enough, or magical enough. His longing to fit a role he barely understands reflects a universal adolescent ache, the fear that identity is a test one can fail. And then there is Alfie, whose gentle arc reframes belonging entirely. He does not win acceptance through power or prestige. Instead, he becomes a reminder that belonging often blossoms from kindness, connection, and the bravery to remain oneself in a world obsessed with spectacle. Moving naturally from belonging to redemption, the narrative deepens its emotional landscape. Draco's storyline anchors this theme with remarkable subtlety. Instead of grand gestures or dramatic confessions, his redemption unfolds through small, deliberate acts of care, guiding a frightened first year, resisting the instinct to lash out, allowing himself to hope that he can be better than the echoes of his past. Redemption here is not a single, shining moment. It is a slow, human process, riddled with backslides and quiet victories. Alistair, too, experiences a form of redemption, though gentler. The relief of realizing that failure does not define him, and that persistence can rewrite the narratives he tells himself. Alfie's redemption is perhaps the most understated of all. He redeems his own self-worth, learning to see value where he once saw only inadequacy. Threaded through all of these arcs is the story's most powerful message, the quiet, unglamorous heroism of ordinary people. In a world filled with dragons, curses, and legendary names, the narrative deliberately centers characters whose courage is instinctive rather than spectacular. Alfie's bravery in crisis is not the result of spell work, but of compassion. Alistair's courage lies in continuing despite fear. Draco's courage is simply returning to a place that remembers his worst mistakes. Through these characters, the story insists that heroism is not loud. It is consistent. It does not demand glory. It demands heart. Thus, the thematic exploration becomes a natural extension of the narrative triad. Three characters, three emotional truths, all converging into one overarching lesson that the magical world does not belong to the extraordinary. It belongs to the sincere, the flawed, the growing. If the themes of belonging, redemption, and ordinary courage provide the emotional heartbeat of the story, then its literary techniques act as the circulatory system carrying those themes through scenes, character arcs, and moments of tension with remarkable precision. Building naturally from the thematic foundation established earlier, the narrative's stylistic strengths amplify its emotional resonance, allowing readers not only to observe these characters, but to inhabit their inner worlds. Foremost among these techniques is the masterful use of interior monologue. Where external action reveals what characters do, interior monologue reveals who they are beneath the surface. Draco's thoughts, sharpened by years of self-reproach, oscillate between sardonic humor and startling vulnerability. His internal voice becomes a constant tug-of-war, one part reluctant professor, one part frightened former student, walking the halls of his own past. Alistair's inner monologue, by contrast, pulses with adolescent urgency. Each mistake feels monumental, each victory fleeting, each longing amplified by his conviction that he must be extraordinary to matter. And then there is Alfie, whose gentle, hesitant thoughts create a tender counterpoint. His mind drifts like a leaf in quiet water, his self-doubt threaded with small flickers of curiosity and courage. These interior landscapes allow the narrative to shift seamlessly from grand magical settings to the intimate terrain of the heart. Yet emotional depth alone would falter without the story's cinematic approach to scene framing. Each location, the dim corridors of Hogwarts, the echoing Great Hall, the steam-warmed windows of the Hogwarts Express, is described with the detail of a carefully composed film shot. Scenes open not with exposition but with sensory cues. Lantern light trembling against stone walls, distant laughter echoing down a staircase, frost gathering on a windowsill, or the hush of falling snow blanketing the Quidditch pitch. The result is immersion so vivid, the reader feels they are stepping into scenes rather than reading them. Tension-heavy moments employ a contrasting style. Pacing shifts into brisk, tight beats that mirror the rhythm of visual storytelling. The acromantula encounter, the chaotic flooding incident, and Alistair's frantic misfires in Transfiguration all unfold with crisp, breathless urgency. Sentences shorten, images sharpen, emotion accelerates. The reader experiences the chaos as though trapped inside it, rather than observing from a safe distance. This cinematic flair extends beyond action to reflection. Quiet scenes linger with soft focus, allowing characters and readers to breathe. A pause before Alfie steps into the common room. A moment of stillness as Draco presses fingers to his temples after a long day. An unhurried look at the stars during an astronomy lesson, where Alistair briefly forgets his anxieties. These moments slow time, emphasizing the emotional weight beneath the magical backdrop. Layered throughout is a subtle but deliberate use of narrative mirroring. Characters echo each other in small gestures, thoughts, and failures. Draco's clenched jaw reflected in Alistair's trembling hands. Alfie's hesitant bravery mirrored in Draco's quiet attempts at patience. These parallels stitch their stories together with invisible thread, reinforcing both theme and cohesion. Through these intertwined techniques, interior monologue, cinematic framing, dynamic pacing, and narrative mirroring, the story becomes more than a series of events. It transforms into an immersive emotional experience where magic is felt not only through spells, but through the intimate humanity of the characters casting them. Building upon the emotional intimacy and cinematic clarity established through the story's literary techniques, the next layer of craftsmanship emerges in its structural precision. If interior monologue gives the narrative its heartbeat and scene framing gives it breath, then the story's multi-arc rhythm becomes its pulse steady, deliberate, and deeply engaging. The arcs of Draco, Alistair, and Alfie do not simply coexist. They dance around one another, rising and falling in a carefully orchestrated pattern that sustains momentum without sacrificing emotional nuance. The story's structure works like a symphony. Draco's arc provides the heavy, resonant bass, the deeper emotional rumblings of redemption and reckoning with the past. Alistair's storyline forms the quick, bright, treble, energetic, unpredictable, sometimes discordant in his adolescent urgency. Alfie contributes the soft, melodic line, a gentle, comforting motif that grounds the narrative whenever tension peaks too sharply. By alternating these arcs with intentional pacing, the story avoids overwhelming the reader. Moments of intensity are consistently followed by quieter interludes, letting each emotional beat land fully. Transitions between characters are crafted with remarkable finesse. Draco's frustration in class may give way to Alfie's quiet self-doubt, highlighting how both wrestle with worthiness in different ways. Alistair's reckless misadventures often follow Draco's moments of reflective melancholy, injecting levity and balancing tone. These transitions function not merely as shifts in perspective, but as tonal counterweights, preventing narrative fatigue and enhancing thematic coherence. Equally impressive is the story's disciplined approach to world-building. Rather than pausing the narrative to explain lore, the magical world reveals itself naturally through daily life. The simmering cauldrons in Draco's classroom, the flickering candlelight during late-night study sessions, the laughter echoing across the Hufflepuff common room, the quiet hum of enchanted portraits following students with knowing eyes. Magic is not treated as spectacle, but as environment, ever-present, textured, and seamlessly integrated. This approach revitalizes the familiar Hogwarts setting without rewriting its foundations. Small expansions breathe new life into the world. House elves with personal motivations. First years blending Muggle problem-solving with traditional spellwork. Students forming unique microcultures within their houses. These additions enrich the reader's sense of immersion without drowning them in excessive detail. Just as world-building supports the setting, structure supports character development. Every scene has purpose. There are no throwaway chapters. A comedic disaster leads to emotional growth. A quiet study session strengthens relationships. A failed spell reveals fears that echo later triumphs. The plot does not carry the characters propel the plot. Their choices, flaws, and breakthroughs shape the story's direction, reinforcing the organic rhythm that binds the arcs together. What emerges is a narrative tapestry, woven with deliberate balance, action and reflection, humor and gravity, world and character. The structural rhythm ensures that readers experience the wizarding world not as passive observers, but as participants following a living, breathing story. Each arc enriches the others. Each moment builds toward a cohesive, emotional crescendo. In this harmony of perspectives, pacing, and world-building, the story achieves a rare blend of complexity and clarity, a structure strong enough to hold magic, yet flexible enough to hold humanity. Flowing naturally from the story's structural harmony, the final layer of meaning emerges through its thematic synthesis, an understanding that binds every character arc, narrative, rhythm, and emotional beat into a cohesive whole. While the world brims with enchantment, mythical creatures, and ancient spells, the narrative makes a quiet yet powerful claim. Magic is not the engine of the story, but the mirror held up to the souls within it. Each spell, mishap, and moment of wonder becomes a reflective surface, revealing the inner truths the characters struggle to articulate. Draco's journey illustrates this most starkly. His magic often falters not from lack of skill, but from emotional weight, hesitation woven from guilt, self-doubt, and the remnants of a past he cannot escape. In the classroom, his wand work steadies only when his resolve does, a subtle but intentional parallel that shows how his path toward redemption is not about mastering charms, but mastering forgiveness. Through him, the story suggests that magic cannot compensate for a fractured heart, but it can illuminate the path toward healing. Alistair, by contrast, showcases the volatility of youth. His spells spark too brightly, sputter too quickly, or explode with unrestrained force echoes of his own desire to define himself in a world of expectations. His magical missteps are never random. They dramatize his fear of inadequacy, his longing to be seen, and his uncertainty about who he is becoming. As his confidence grows, so does his control, illustrating that resilience, not raw talent, is the truest measure of magical maturity. And then there is Alfie. His relationship to magic is the purest mirror of all, precisely because he possesses so little instinctive control over it. His misfires reflect his self-doubt. His successes arise not from mastery, but from moments of courage, kindness, and clarity. The narrative uses him to underscore a profound truth. Magic is not the source of worth. Rather, it magnifies the qualities already present within a person. Alfie's greatest triumphs occur without a wand in hand, reaffirming that bravery and gentleness can be as transformative as any spell. What unites these three arcs is not similarity of experience, but the universality of struggle. Magic becomes the external expression of internal battles, fear into sparks, hope into light, shame into silence, courage into protection. By framing magic as a symbolic force rather than a literal one, the story recasts the fantastical world into an emotional landscape where growth is the true enchantment. This synthesis also reframes heroism. None of the characters achieve legendary feats. Their victories are small, imperfect, and deeply human. Draco learns to face a past he once fled. Alistair learns to trust himself when certainty falters. Alfie learns he belongs in a world he believed had no room for him. Each transformation unfolds quietly, yet resonates profoundly like magic, humming under the surface. In the end, the story's message crystallizes into shimmering clarity. Magic does not define the wizard defines the magic. Through empathy, perseverance, and self-discovery, even the most ordinary heart can shape extraordinary meaning. And in this alchemy of growth, the story finds its true brilliance, proving that the most powerful magic is the kind that transforms people from within.